Hello, 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 and happy Saturday! This 2014 episode traces the story of makeup throughout history, including all of the various elements used to create cosmetics and develop beautiful colors, and how the production of inexpensive mirrors made people much more aware of their appearance.
So let's jump into the business of cosmetics.
Welcome to Stuff You Missed in History Class from HowStuffWorks.com.
Hello and welcome to the podcast. I'm Holly Fry.
And I'm Tracy B. Wilson.
So here's a thing that everybody sees all the time and may or may not think very much about. It is makeup. It's such a common part of our society that we really don't think about it outside our own use normally, unless that is like your field of interest or career. But it really has a rich and lengthy history that spans the globe. It crosses cultures. It goes so far back, and it's been in so many sort of places in terms of where it's trended and what kind of things have been used. So that's what we're talking about today. And just to kind of set it up for you, we're going to jump around a little bit from location to location and talk about like how things developed in each location. So the timeline isn't going to be strictly followed, although we will start in the oldest known location of makeup and then kind of end up in the West in the early half of the 20th century where it really became an actual industry. And so we're covering this very wide swath. So I feel like I need to, just give everybody a heads up front that there's definitely stuff that isn't going to get covered. And if we miss something that you're fond of or, you want to know more about, or if it's your favorite thing and you wish we had mentioned it, that's always a good reason to send us an email, and we'll have the contact info at the end of the episode like we always do. So for right now, climb into your time machine or your TARDIS if that's your thing, and we are going to whisk away first to ancient Egypt.
So as early as 10,000 BCE in Egypt, moisturizing emollients were being used to protect people's skin against the very dry desert climate.
And perfumes were also popular during this time. They were pretty much used in ceremonial religious events. And it's interesting because these included ingredients such as peppermint, lily, lavender, almond oil, chamomile, things that are still popular in cosmetics today.
Later on in Egypt's history, so around 4000 to 3500 BCE, that's when we see the first known use of true makeup. Galena, which is the mineral form of lead sulfide, and malachite, which is a green-hued carbonate of copper, were used as eye enhancements. And you see these really often in Egyptian art. These are minerals that would be ground down and combined with burned almonds, lead, and ash, also ground into a fine powder. And this created kohl eyeliner.
So one of the most popular looks is that green shading would be used on the lower eye, sort of under the eye, while the charcoal gray and, solid black would be used for the top lid. And this is creating a look that sometimes is still in a stylized version mimicked today and called a Cleopatra eye, although she actually falls a little bit later on the timeline than this.
During this time, it also became really popular for people to carry around small makeup boxes with them when they went to social events. These were sort of the first evening clutches.
Yeah, and they also sort of represented a certain class level. Like if you were a very fancy person, you could have your own fancy makeup box that you carried around with you. And both Egyptian women and men used lipstick as well. And some lip color during this time was made from a combination of a purplish red dye, which was taken from seaweed. There was also a bit of iodine and a bromine mannite that were used. But this is one of those many instances where people suffer for what's fashionable, because since bromine mannite is a toxic plant derivative, this made the potential price of beauty very, very steep, not just for the wearer, but also anyone that the wearer kissed. It could really cause some very severe illness and even death with a surprisingly small dose.
During Cleopatra's era, which her reign was from 51 to 30 BCE, lip color was a really big trend. Ground carmine beetles gave her lip tint this lush red tone, while non-royals had to go with this mixture of watered down clay.
Yeah, you'll sometimes also see accounts that say that she combined carmine beetles and ground ants to create this color that she liked. And one of the interesting benefits of these various concoctions that were being used by the ancient Egyptians for beauty, specifically for their eyes, was that they also had antibacterial properties. In 2009, a team of scientists published a report in Analytical Chemistry detailing the study that they conducted using 52 makeup samples. And these are all samples that are held by the Louvre. And this team used electron microscopy and X ray diffraction to analyze this makeup. And they were able to identify galena, which is mentioned above, and it was used to make dark tones, as well as lighter colored compounds of cerussite, laurionite, and phosgenite. And all of these chemicals are lead based.
So the lead content acted as a toxin to kill bacteria. Specifically, bacterial infections of the eye were a big problem in ancient Egypt. So this use of heavy coal around the eye probably did a good job of warding off a lot of those infections. We also know from art that cosmetics were believed to be a form of magic in ancient Egypt. So the researchers make the case that these antibacterial formulations on the part of ancient Egyptian chemists were deliberate, and they weren't just this accidental offshoot of the quest for beauty.
Yeah, the initial use may have been, but they develop it. And there's a passage in their report that reads, quote, "One cannot evidently go so far as to propose that the laurionite was purposely introduced into the composition of the makeup because of any recognized antibacterial properties. Yet one can presume that ancient Egyptian chemists recognized empirically that whenever this white precipitate was present in the makeup paste, their bearers were enjoying better health and thus decided to amplify this empirical protective function by specifically manufacturing laurionite."
So the problem here, which was probably obvious, is that lead, while toxic to bacteria, is also toxic to human beings. So there was a problem.
Yeah. Yeah, so that is sort of the legacy of Egypt, is that I think we hear a lot more about sort of the lead being toxic to people, which it is, of course, but it also kind of helping them with their vision and to prevent ocular problems is less discussed. So, having hit on Egypt, we're now going to pop over to Asia at around 3000 BCE. And this is where we, to the best of our knowledge, we first see the use of people coloring their fingernails, which was happening in China at this time. And it's often referred to as the first nail polish, but in truth, this was more of a stain situation. Color pigments were mixed in with egg, beeswax, gum arabic, and gelatin to create these stains. And vibrant or deep colors were reserved exclusively for royals, whereas other people would have to go with much paler tones.
If we move ahead into about 1500 BCE in both China and Japan, the aesthetic of paleness became the pinnacle of beauty, and rice powder started to be used to create this illusion of a flawless white complexion.
And at this point, henna dyes were also used to stain hair as well as facial features. So it's almost like if you've ever seen someone have their makeup tattooed, which sometimes women will still get eyeliner tattoos. This was sort of like the semi-permanent version, because henna will last a much longer time than if you use kohl.
Then we can hop over to Greece. At about the same time as fingernail stains were becoming popular in China, in Greece, having white lead face paint was really all the rage.
And they would add a flush to their cheeks over this white paint using this compound that was made of crushed mulberries. And they would crush the mulberries down and then use the juice as a stain.
Fake eyebrows also became really popular, and they were usually made with the hair of oxen, which sounds very itchy to me.
It does. It also sounds kind of funny to me, just the idea of, augmented fake eyebrows, since it's not the aesthetic of the modern world for the most part, certainly not the Western modern world. Like the idea of people purposely giving themselves really heavy eyebrows strikes me as kind of entertaining. So if we move forward a couple thousand years in the history of Greece to 1000 BCE, you'll see that the white complexion was still very favored at this time, and the white lead was still used, but chalk was growing in popularity as an alternative.
Lip color also became really popular, and it was usually made with clay and red iron.
And now we are going to once again shift gears and locations, and we're going to Mesopotamia. So it's not a long journey at this point. And we're once again going back to 3000 BCE. And this is actually the space between 3000 and 1500 BCE that these things were happening. And Mesopotamian ladies at this time had a pretty spectacular approach to lip color. They would actually grind semi-precious stones to dust and use that dust as a lip and a face adornment.
There was also a lot of use of spiced perfumes during this time, and kohl was also used to line both the eyes and the eyebrows. People in Mesopotamia also used henna as a nail stain.
And perfume concoction was actually taken pretty seriously in this area by the 9th century. I feel like perfume on its own could be a whole other podcast, so this won't be completely in depth, but I will mention it a couple times since it is technically a cosmetic as well. So at this point, we have crossed over from BCE to CE at this point, or Common Era. And perfumer Yaqub al-Kindi, who lived from about 803 to 870, wrote a book called The Book of Perfume Chemistry and Distillation. And this described the uses of many essential oils. And even former podcast subject Avicenna introduced new chemistry concepts around this time that really changed the distillation of alcohol for both medicinal and perfume use significantly. So there was some pretty important groundwork being laid in this area at this time.
In the year 100 in Rome, a personal interest of mine, because this has always been a trouble spot for me, is when pimple treatment really hit the scene. People in Rome were using a mixture of barley flour and butter to apply to blemishes to try to soothe them and remove the irritation.
And this is another location where we see fingernail color becoming popular. They used a combination of animal fat and blood and then applied that to the nails to give a pink to red tint to their fingernails, depending on the formulation. Like it would kind of vary on how pale or deep it was just by playing with the amounts of blood in the formula.
Over in India, between 300 and 400, is when henna became really popular as both a hair dye and in mehndi art. Henna and mehndi are both still around as popular cosmetic practices in India today. Mehndi is the henna artwork on people's skin.
Yeah, and it's often so beautiful, like to see all of the really intricate designs. So now, jumping into Europe, while there is definitely evidence of the use of rouge, kohl, bath oils, and perfumes in the Roman Empire at the start of the Common Era, the fall of the Roman Empire in the 5th century really marks this sort of vanishing in cosmetics in Europe for a time, at least as any sort of common practice. It was probably happening in pockets or in some of the very, sort of upper echelons of society, but it really was not a common thing for people to wear makeup there for a bit.
That started to change around 1200 when, thanks to the Crusades, perfumes and other cosmetics started traveling from the Middle East into Europe and were reintroduced into the culture.
And between 1400 and 1500, this is when we really first start to see cosmetics as an industry start to heat up. And this was happening in Italy and France primarily. Other places in Europe were using them, but this is where they were mostly being made. But even so, the concept of perfumes and cosmetics was really still the privilege of the upper classes.
This is also the period when the art and science of perfume as we know it today was born in France.
Yeah, we mentioned perfume happening in other places earlier, but this is really where what we would call our today's sort of perfume production and development. This is really where the modern versions of perfume started. And between 1500 and 1600, we are now into Elizabethan era. And it's no secret that Queen Elizabeth I popularized red hair in Europe. She also, as the Virgin Queen, was a trendsetter when it came to the use of white lead for creating this illusion of youth.
Ceruse was made from white lead combined with vinegar, and it caused a number of skin problems. It caused the skin to become gray and shriveled, and Queen Elizabeth is said to have developed this pockmarked appearance to her natural skin, which she just covered with progressively heavier and heavier layers of ceruse.
Yeah, so the thing that was really ruining her skin, she was also using to cover up that ruination, and it just kind of kept getting worse and worse. And it began to be noticed that this white lead-based paint was really causing a problem with people's skin and their health. And so while some women opted instead to use egg whites, they would just use plain egg whites and sort of glaze their face to create this illusion of a smoother, paler complexion. There were plenty of others that just thought that applying any cosmetics was going to create a health threat because they believed it compromised circulation.
People later figured out that ceruse was toxic, and it was linked to a number of physical problems, including facial tremors and muscle paralysis, which, given that it contained so much lead, is not surprising. The toxic compound was also recognized as being lethal with cumulative use, and it's possible that it contributed to Queen Elizabeth's death.
Yeah, she was also getting older. I mean, there were probably a few different factors involved in that, but it is sometimes mentioned as one of the possible contributors. And in less dangerous beauty doings, though, Elizabeth I had also used a lip color that was made, I find this so charming, from beeswax and crushed flowers.
I'm glad you said that because I feel the exact same way, especially.
This sounds much less horrifying after the ruined, pockmarked skin from the makeup she had been wearing prior.
So to achieve the queen's locks and even to get lighter blonde tones, people used concoctions of sulfur, honey, and alum. It was sort of a Renaissance version of Sun-In, if anybody else remembers that product. It would be applied to the hair and then exposed to the sun to create lighter and brighter hair.
And that's another thing that, we mentioned Sun-In, which was very popular in the 80s, is a thing that people would spray in their hair and it had hydrogen peroxide and would lighten it. But I also think of even like Breakfast at Tiffany's, where she would put lemon juice on her hair and sit in the sun. It's the same concept.
Yeah, that's been around for a while. My mom and her sisters, who, were growing up in the 40s and 50s, would talk about putting lemon juice in their hair and laying out in the sun.
Yeah.
Don't do that. It's bad for you. So
please see a licensed stylist or colorist to change your hair color.
Less for the hair, but for the laying out in the sun, not a good idea.
Yeah, all of it. There are a number of potential problems there, especially because, and this is a complete aside, but some citrus will really react poorly with your skin in the sun if it's exposed, and you can get some really, really dangerous and bad problems. So again, we're not saying to try any of these beauty treatments. And if you go online, in fact, there are places where you can find like recipes for cosmetics that were popular in Queen Elizabeth's era, but they will even say, please don't make these. This is for historical use only, not as an instruction manual for you to create toxins to put on your face.
I kind of do want to make some lipstick out of beeswax and crushed flowers, though.
I worry it would be woefully disappointing, and then I would be like, why didn't I just buy something? So in 1800, zinc oxide started to become popular as a face powder. And of course, this is a much safer replacement for the lead and copper that were being used prior.
And by this point in the timeline, the use of makeup has permeated through almost all of the classes.
And the development of cosmetics popularity throughout Europe, specifically in Great Britain, was arrested a little bit when Queen Victoria denounced makeup as completely improper, suitable only for the stage. And it was makeup's association with prostitutes at this point that led her to this very vocal stance. And so respectable women did not paint their faces.
Makeup did remain popular in France during this time, though, even though respectable society in Britain and the Americas did not look upon it favorably at all. It kind of reminds me of the reality show Frontier House that was on PBS. Mm-hmm. They take the makeup away from all of the women, and some of them are extremely sad about that fact.
So remembering that France at this time was like, nope, we're still going to wear some makeup. It should not surprise you that the first modern lipstick was actually manufactured in Paris in 1884. And this came wrapped in silk paper, which just sounds so luxurious to me. And it was made from deer tallow, which is solid rendered fat, which sounds less glamorous, castor oil, and beeswax. And just as had been used in Cleopatra's time, carmine dye gave this lipstick its red tint.
In the late 1890s, color for the lips and cheeks was offered for the first time in the Sears Roebuck catalog.
Yeah, so at this point, we're not just in Europe, but also into the Americas and, kind of Western culture at that point. But before we go on to what starts to happen next, which is pretty exciting, do you want to do another word from our sponsor?
Sure. So to return to the story of makeup, we're going to jump over to the early 1900s. After Victoria's death, Edwardian society started to really embrace the idea of makeup and cosmetics. although often the use of it was still highly denounced, even by people who were benefiting from them. This was basically the Edwardian equivalent of denying that you got Botox or had surgical touch-ups.
Yeah, people would be like, "Oh, are you are you wearing a lip tint?" No, this is my natural lip color. It was, it was kind of funny. And this is really the period when beauty salons became relatively common in the Western world. Although, because of this denial mentality about using any sort of cosmetics was still pretty common, people also denied going to see these, to beauty salons. Patrons would actually often come and go through a back or a side door so they wouldn't be seen patronizing these establishments.
Industrialization led to several developments that really sowed the seeds of the cosmetics industry as we know it today. There was the invention of photography, which meant that people started having portraits made, not sitting for a portrait forever from a painter who was going to maybe touch you up as he went, but actual photographs. It became pretty clear to people that having some makeup on would make the picture look nicer. And since most people had to save up for these photography sessions, they had to really make them count. So people started really relying on makeup as a way to make sure they would look their best in the pictures that they were spending so much money on.
Yeah, I mean, this was a time when you would maybe have your picture taken a few times in your lifetime. So each of those pictures had to be the best possible. And additionally, this is the time when mirrors became a commonly manufactured item. So looking glasses have been around since at least 6000 BCE, and they were certainly familiar objects in European high society in the Renaissance. But the late 1800s and early 1900s was really the first time that mirrors were inexpensive enough that they crossed all class boundaries. And so this meant that everyone became more aware of their day-to-day appearance. And this meant that everyone grew a little more interested in cosmetics.
And then there were movies. As actors made the transition from the stage to the screen, their makeup had to adapt. It quickly became clear that stage makeup did not look good on film, which if you've ever worn stage makeup is not a surprise. Stage makeup does not look good anywhere except on stage. It was, especially on film, it was really too heavy and looked very clownish.
And this is where famous names start to appear, because Max Factor, who was primarily a wig maker at this time for film, developed foundation paints that had a more subtle effect. He really is often referred to as the inventor of pancake makeup. And these makeups looked more natural on cinema screens, and he this development happened in 1914, and this kicked off his now famous makeup company, which initially catered exclusively to the acting world.
A year later, in 1915, the Maybelline Company was founded by T.L. Williams to sell an adapted version of his sister's petroleum jelly and coal dust mascara to the public. This version of mascara came in a cake form, and eventually mascara went through a wax phase before becoming the liquid that most people are more familiar with today. However, Maybelline still makes one of the most highly reviewed mascaras among the general public and makeup artists alike.
Yeah, that famous sort of pink and green tube of mascara that Maybelline has manufactured for years and years and years. It's really quite funny. If you ever talk to a makeup artist, most of them will mention that that's still their favorite. Just kind of interesting. It's been around for 100 years, not in that form, but the company has. Also in 1915, the metal retractable lipstick tube was invented. So this is when it went from being kind of a round cake that you would apply to actually being a thing you could twist up and down and toss in your handbag and not be a problem. It was easy to carry. It was easy to apply on the go. Although this is also a time when stencils were marketed to assure that users could get like that perfect Clairabeau pouch. Those would have been a little trickier to tuck into a handbag because they were sort of, I'm estimating the sizes, but I've seen pictures of people where they look like they're probably about a 4x4 4-inch by 4-inch card with this little kind of heart-shaped lipstick stencil cut out of the middle, and you'd put it over your lips and then apply your lipstick so that it would be the perfect shape.
After years of catering to film stars, Max Factor decided to expand his business by selling his formulas to the masses. And as the decadence and the glamour of the flapper girl was on the rise in the 1920s, makeup, which is a term he's said to have coined, made movie star looks available to everybody.
And this really started a landslide of popularity. So before mass production, makeup had been a little bit tedious. People would have to either figure out ways to kind of concoct their own, or they would buy these sort of bizarre formulations and have to apply them, and they didn't look very natural. And it was just, there were a lot of barriers to use. But as it became easily purchased and easily applied, like you didn't need a lot of special skills, it became very quickly adopted into the mainstream.
On average, the global beauty market has grown about 4.5% each year for the last 20 years, with some downward fluctuation concurrent with economic issues. I think we actually have an article on the website about the lipstick indicator.
Yeah. And today, the global sales for cosmetics is estimated to be about $170 billion a year. And that breaks down to about $40 billion in the Americas, about $60 billion in Europe, about $60 billion in Australia and Asia combined, and another $10 billion in Africa. And the Western world spends the most per person on cosmetics, but it is really just a shade ahead of Asia on this. So it's interesting to me. It feels like, industrialization is kind of what has catapulted us into, almost this obsession with beauty and looks, and sort of always being super self-conscious about what we look like. Whereas before that, maybe a little more relaxed.
I had thought about the role of people having easy access to mirrors in sort of the perception of what beauty is and what you should look like and how much care you should put into your appearance. But it had never dawned on me that photography played a role also.
Yeah, I mean, it's these various things that kind of fold in on themselves, and they kind of add layers of consciousness to this idea of beauty and looks. And it's very easy, sort of, I think, to see how that eventually develops and becomes a bigger and bigger thing, and television changing that as well, and seeing people on TV all the time who are allegedly, air quote, normal, looking particularly beautiful and wanting to aspire to look the same as them, and how you could see where we landed today, where this is this huge industry. So that is a sort of, high level, glossy version of kind of how makeup has developed around the world through the years. I would love to go back and do more on Asia, which we only briefly covered because there's so much great stuff there. And I'm sure there are people with instant image conjuring going on in their head of like geisha with their beautiful and very specific makeup rules, and some of the theatrical makeups that go on there. And perhaps we will get to that on another episode, but for today, that's where we're at.
Thank you so much for joining us on this Saturday. If you have heard an email address or a Facebook URL or something similar over the course of today's episode, since it is from the archive, that might be out of date now. You can email us at historypodcast@howstuffworks.com, and you can find us all over social media at Missed in History. And you can subscribe to our show on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, the iHeartRadio app, and wherever else you listen to podcasts.
For more on this and thousands of other topics, visit howstuffworks.com.